the judgment that quietly directs you. Hold this point steady as we begin. There is a thought you carry that has never been examined. It feels so familiar that it escapes notice. It moves beneath your reactions, your frustrations, and your sense of being right or wronged. Because it has never been questioned, it governs you without resistance. The Stoic claim is simple and uncompromising. Events themselves are neutral. They do not arrive with meaning attached. What disturbs you is not what happens, but what you decide it means. This decision is usually so fast that it feels automatic. Yet it is still a decision. When something goes against your preference, the mind reaches for an explanation. It judges the event as bad, unfair, threatening, or unacceptable. In that moment, disturbance is already formed. Not because the world acted, but because judgment agreed. This is where responsibility begins. Not in controlling outcomes. Not in correcting other people. Not in waiting for circumstances to improve. Responsibility begins at the point where judgment is formed and accepted. That point cannot be outsourced. Stoic discipline refuses comfort here. It does not blame your past, your temperament, or the difficulty of the situation. It does not promise ease. It insists instead on clarity. If judgment creates disturbance, then judgment is also where freedom must be recovered. This is not a theory meant to impress. It is a mechanism meant to be observed. You can watch it operate today, in something small. A delay. A comment. A minor inconvenience. Notice how quickly meaning appears, and how quickly you agree with it. Hold this distinction, the boundary you keep crossing. Everything that follows depends on one clear distinction. There is a line that determines whether effort produces stability or frustration. Most people cross it repeatedly without noticing. They treat what does not belong to them as if it were theirs to manage, and neglect what is actually under their authority. From this confusion, tension grows. According to Stoic discipline, very little truly belongs to you. Your judgments belong to you. Your intentions belong to you. Your choices, refusals, and the use you make of impressions belong to you. Everything else does not. Not outcomes. Not other people's behavior. Not reputation. Not timing. Not whether your efforts succeed or fail in the world. This division is not pessimism. It is precision. When you expect control where none exists, effort turns into strain. Consider something ordinary. You prepare carefully for a conversation, but the other person misunderstands you. You feel irritation rise. The irritation does not come from their misunderstanding. It comes from the hidden belief that you were entitled to be understood. That belief crosses the boundary. Or consider delay. You plan your day, but something interrupts it. The mind reacts with resistance. Again, the disturbance does not come from the interruption. It comes from the judgment that your plan should have prevailed. That judgment assumes authority over what was never yours. Stoic discipline begins by removing this false claim. You are not asked to like events. You are asked to locate responsibility correctly. What happens is not yours. How you judge it is. This matters because discipline cannot operate without clear ownership. When you attempt to discipline outcomes, you exhaust yourself. When you attempt to discipline others, you become resentful. When you attempt to discipline circumstances, you become rigid. None of these efforts produce freedom. Discipline only applies where choice exists. This is why Stoicism insists on narrowing the field. Not to reduce life, but to concentrate authority. When your attention returns to judgment, effort becomes clean. You stop negotiating with the uncontrollable. You stop rehearsing arguments with reality. You stop treating frustration as proof that something has gone wrong. Nothing has gone wrong. A boundary was crossed. Notice how often language reveals this confusion. This shouldn't be happening. They shouldn't act this way. I shouldn't feel this. Each statement quietly assumes control where there is none. Each produces disturbance without adding capability. Stoic practice does not suppress these thoughts by force. It corrects them by clarity. When you see that something is not yours, insistence dissolves. You still act where action is appropriate. You still speak when reason requires it. But you do not attach your stability to compliance from the world. This distinction removes blame without removing responsibility. You are not excused from effort. You are released from false demands. The effort that remains is directed inward, toward judgment and assent, where it can actually succeed. Most people never establish this boundary. They attempt improvement while still arguing with reality. As a result, even discipline feels like pressure. But once ownership is precise, effort changes character. It becomes deliberate instead of desperate. This boundary is the foundation. Without it, every technique fails. With it, disturbance becomes intelligible rather than mysterious. The boundary is clear. The mechanism is not yet, the silent yes of judgment. Now we look at what actually creates disturbance. The boundary of control explains where effort belongs, but it does not yet explain why disturbance feels inevitable. For that, you must see how the mind moves. Not in theory, but in sequence. Something happens. An impression appears. A sound, a message, a delay, a facial expression, a physical sensation. This arrival is automatic. You do not choose it. You are not responsible for it. The Stoics were precise here. Impressions present themselves the way light enters the eye. There is no discipline required for this stage. The problem begins when the mind adds a verdict. Almost immediately, the impression is interpreted. This is bad. This is disrespectful. This is a threat. This should not be happening. That interpretation feels inseparable from the impression, but it is not. It is an added judgment. Then comes the most important moment. Assent. Assent is the quiet agreement the mind gives to its own judgment. It is the internal yes that says, this interpretation is true, this meaning is correct, this reaction is justified. Disturbance does not appear before this point. It appears after it. This matters because assent is optional. You may feel a surge of irritation when criticized. That feeling is not a failure. It is an impression combined with habit. But when the thought appears, I am being disrespected, and you accept it without examination, disturbance takes hold. The feeling intensifies because judgment has been endorsed. Or consider delay again. The body tightens. The mind produces the thought, this is wasting my time. The tension does not come from waiting. It comes from agreeing that waiting is an injury. The moment you assent to that claim, impatience becomes justified in your own eyes. Stoic discipline does not deny feeling. It denies automatic agreement. This distinction is often missed. People try to control emotion directly. They attempt to suppress anger, fear, or frustration. This fails because emotion is downstream. The work is earlier. It is at the point where the mind decides what something means. Between impression and reaction, there is a pause. It may be brief. It may be barely noticeable. But it exists. In that pause, assent either happens or it does not. Freedom lives there. Most disturbance persists not because impressions are strong, but because assent is unexamined. The mind treats its first interpretation as fact. It never asks whether agreement is necessary. It never asks whether the judgment belongs to it. Notice how quickly this happens in ordinary life. A message is read with the wrong tone. A plan changes. Someone forgets something important to you. In each case, an explanation forms instantly. The explanation feels obvious. Because it feels obvious, it goes unquestioned. Because it goes unquestioned, it governs your state. Stoic training introduces friction at this exact point. Not argument. Not denial. Just delay. A refusal to immediately say yes. You are not asked to say the judgment is false. You are asked to withhold agreement until it is examined. This is a small act, but it changes everything. Without assent, the impression remains just an impression. It may be uncomfortable, but it does not rule you. This is why Epictetus insisted that freedom depends on judgment. Not because judgment is powerful, but because it is yours. No one else can assent for you. No circumstance can force agreement. Even when emotion is strong, consent still belongs to you. This is the part that demands responsibility. You cannot blame the speed of the mind. You cannot blame habit. You cannot blame temperament. You can only notice when agreement occurs, and practice interrupting it. Understanding this mechanism does not create discipline, the kind of training most people avoid. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. They imagine discipline as force, as endurance, as pushing through resistance by tightening the jaw and suppressing reaction. This image is familiar, and it is wrong. Force exhausts attention. Suppression creates pressure. Neither produces stability. Stoic discipline is training, not coercion. Training means repetition under low stakes. It means working with the mind before pressure arrives, not wrestling with it after judgment has already taken hold. This is why insight alone does nothing. You may understand the mechanism of judgment perfectly and still react the same way tomorrow. Understanding is not training. Training is what changes default behavior. Consider how habits are formed in the body. You do not wait until exhaustion to learn proper form. You practice when conditions are manageable. You repeat the movement correctly until it becomes available under strain. The mind is no different. Most people wait until emotion is intense before attempting control. By then, assent has already happened. The judgment feels justified. Discipline at that point becomes punishment. You scold yourself for reacting. You try to suppress what is already active. This teaches nothing. Stoic practice begins earlier. It trains attention to notice impressions as impressions. It trains recognition of the moment when judgment appears. It trains restraint at the point of assent, not resistance at the point of explosion. This is why Stoic discipline does not aim to eliminate emotion. That goal is neither realistic nor necessary. The aim is accuracy. Emotion is information. Judgment decides what to do with it. Training improves that decision. Repetition matters more than intensity. A single dramatic effort does not rewire habit. Small, consistent acts do. Each time you notice an impression and delay agreement, you weaken the reflex to assent automatically. Each time you examine a judgment instead of endorsing it, you strengthen choice. This work is quiet. It does not look impressive. There is no external sign that it is happening. But over time, the interval between impression and assent lengthens. That interval is the space where freedom operates. Many avoid this kind of training because it offers no spectacle. There is no sense of victory. No feeling of being powerful. Often there is only the awareness that you almost reacted, and did not. That feels anticlimactic to a mind accustomed to drama. Yet this is exactly why it works. Stoic discipline removes the need for confrontation. You do not fight the mind. You do not argue with every thought. You simply refuse to rush agreement. You practice this refusal when the stakes are small, so that it is available when they are not. Notice how different this is from willpower. Willpower is consumed by effort. Training conserves it. Willpower relies on mood. Training operates regardless of mood. Willpower tries to overpower habit. Training reshapes habit itself. This is also why Stoic discipline must be practiced daily. Not continuously. Not obsessively. Briefly, deliberately, and repeatedly. The goal is familiarity with the pause. Familiarity with choosing not to choose immediately. When discipline is understood this way, it no longer feels like pressure. It feels like alignment. You are no longer forcing yourself to behave differently. You are teaching yourself to see differently. That is the only change that lasts. Training remains abstract unless it appears in daily life, where practice replaces theory. This practice is proven in ordinary moments. Philosophy remains abstract until it meets the day as it actually unfolds. Not in retreats or quiet hours, but in interruption, friction, and inconvenience. This is where Stoic discipline either becomes real or collapses into opinion. Daily practice does not require drama. It requires accuracy. The first practice is anticipating impressions without anxiety. This does not mean expecting the worst. It means recognizing, in advance, that impressions will arrive. Delays will occur. People will misunderstand you. Plans will shift. Bodies will feel tired. Technology will fail. None of this is surprising. What causes disturbance is not their arrival, but the unexamined assumption that they should not arrive. When you anticipate impressions accurately, you remove surprise. You do not brace yourself emotionally. You simply acknowledge the terrain. When something occurs, the mind is less likely to rush into judgment because it was not promised a smooth path. The second practice is pausing before assent. This is the central act. It does not require long reflection. One breath is enough. The breath is not a calming technique. It is a marker. It creates a fraction of space between impression and agreement. In that space, you do not ask whether the judgment feels convincing. You ask whether agreement is required. Often it is not. The judgment may still be there. The feeling may still be present. But without assent, neither directs you. This pause is easiest to practice when the stakes are low. A minor annoyance. A brief inconvenience. A comment that could be interpreted in several ways. These moments are training grounds. Each time you pause, you reinforce the habit of not rushing agreement. The third practice is evening review without guilt or praise. At the end of the day, you look back briefly. Not to congratulate yourself. Not to condemn yourself. You simply observe. Where did assent happen quickly? Where did you pause? Where did judgment go unnoticed? Guilt has no role here. Guilt is itself an unexamined judgment. It adds a second layer of disturbance without improving accuracy. Praise is equally unnecessary. The goal is not to feel good about practice. The goal is to see clearly. This review trains recognition. Over time, patterns become visible. Certain situations consistently trigger assent. Certain judgments repeat. This is not a personal failure. It is information. And information, once seen, can be worked with. These practices are deliberately modest. They do not promise control over life. They establish control over judgment. They do not remove difficulty. They prevent unnecessary disturbance from being added to difficulty. Notice that none of this requires withdrawal from responsibility. You still act. You still plan. You still speak and decide. The difference is that action is no longer entangled with insistence that reality comply with preference. Consistency matters more than duration. A brief pause practiced daily is more effective than long reflection practiced rarely. The mind learns through repetition, not resolution. When this practice becomes stable, something changes quietly. You begin to notice impressions earlier. Judgments feel less compulsory. The pause becomes familiar rather than forced. This is not because you have achieved control, but because you have stopped overreaching it. Stoic discipline does not add new demands to life. It removes false ones. From practice, sovereignty emerges. What freedom still depends on? Freedom is often misunderstood. It is commonly imagined as ease, flexibility, or the absence of constraint. By that definition, freedom appears fragile. It depends on favorable conditions. It disappears when life becomes demanding. Stoic discipline rejects this view entirely. Freedom, in the Stoic sense, is not the removal of difficulty. It is the preservation of authority. Life does not become easier when you practice this discipline. Interruptions still occur. Loss still happens. Other people remain unpredictable. The body ages. Outcomes remain uncertain. None of this changes. What changes is where command is located. When judgment is no longer surrendered automatically, authority returns inward. You are no longer compelled to react simply because something occurred. You are no longer forced into agreement because a thought appeared. This is not comfort. It is command. Comfort seeks protection from disturbance. Freedom accepts disturbance without surrendering judgment. This distinction matters. Comfort can always be taken away. It relies on circumstances aligning with preference. Freedom does not. It depends only on your use of impressions. As long as judgment remains yours, freedom remains intact. This is why Stoic freedom must be maintained rather than achieved. There is no final state where the work ends. There is only continued attention to assent. Each day presents new impressions. Each day offers opportunities to either preserve authority or hand it over. Many people believe they lose freedom when they feel strong emotion. This is not accurate. Emotion does not remove choice. Unexamined judgment does. You may feel fear and still choose deliberately. You may feel anger and still withhold assent. What matters is not the presence of feeling, but the status of agreement. This understanding removes self-deception. You can no longer claim that circumstances forced your reaction. You can no longer say that the moment was too intense for choice. The pause may have been brief, but it was there. Responsibility remains. This responsibility is not heavy when accepted correctly. It becomes heavy only when you demand control over what is not yours. When responsibility is confined to judgment, it becomes manageable. It becomes precise. Freedom also does not mean passivity. You still act decisively when reason requires it. You still set boundaries. You still pursue goals. The difference is that action is no longer fueled by the demand that outcomes guarantee your stability. You act because it is appropriate, not because you are trying to secure peace. This is why Stoic discipline produces steadiness rather than excitement. There is no emotional surge that signals freedom. Often there is only the absence of unnecessary agitation. The absence itself is the result. What cannot be taken from you is this capacity to withhold assent. It does not depend on permission. It does not require favorable conditions. Even under pressure, even in constraint, judgment remains available. This is not an abstract consolation. It is a practical safeguard. When you know exactly where freedom resides, you stop looking for it elsewhere. You stop demanding it from people. You stop bargaining with circumstances. You stop postponing it until life improves. Nothing outside you must change for this to begin. This brings us to the final responsibility, the responsibility that remains. This ends where responsibility begins. Nothing here requires escalation. No dramatic change. No confrontation with the world. What remains is simple and exacting. You are responsible for how you use impressions. That responsibility cannot be transferred. Events will continue to arrive without asking permission. Thoughts will continue to appear without warning. Feelings will continue to move through the body. None of this is a problem. The problem only begins when judgment is surrendered without examination. Stoic discipline does not demand perfection. You will assent too quickly at times. You will notice judgment only after disturbance has already formed. This does not invalidate the practice. It defines it. Each recognition is part of training. What cannot be justified is refusal to take responsibility for assent. You may explain behavior. You may acknowledge difficulty. But you cannot honestly claim that judgment was unavailable. It was present, even if briefly. That is enough. This is why responsibility in Stoicism is non-negotiable and calm. There is no accusation here. Only clarity. If judgment creates disturbance, then judgment is where work must occur. Nothing else can substitute for this. Do not wait for better conditions. Do not wait for fewer pressures. Do not wait to feel ready. The practice is available wherever impressions arise. Return to the pause.